Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to Stereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. As we are starting 2024, I'm going to talk about a point-and-click game that was requested to me some time ago by a patron via Patreon. Which game consists of one of the acceptable ones for the ST. Developed and published by Delphine Software in 1989, this game is Les Voyageurs du Temps, aka Future Wars. Before digging into the game, I'd like to talk about the company behind it, Delphine Software International.
Delphine is a French company which, for games more specifically, was founded in 1988 by the late Paul-Marie-André de Senneville and co-directed by himself and by Paul Cuisset, who was its vice president. It was responsible for a number of notable titles, including Operation Stealth, Cruise for a Corpse, Another World, and Flashback, released in the very early 1990s. One of Delphine Software's trademarks, let's say, was the cinematographic aspect of their games, at least of the first ones, a bit like Cinemaware, responsible for Defender of the Crown, released in 1986, and for which I made an episode some time ago. The game of this episode, for its part, dates from 1989 in its ST version. It's a third-person point-and-click game in which the protagonist is shown on the screen and is able to move around, unlike in Maupiti Island, for instance, in which we adopt a first-person point of view.
If you watched my Monkey Island or The Last Crusade episodes, you already know what a point-and-click adventure game is, but for those who don't, here's a reminder.
As of the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were intrigue and puzzle games, let's say, with or without visuals, in which commands had to be entered using the keyboard. This genre was called text adventure. Generally, the story structure was rather linear, meaning you had to complete stage A before proceeding to stage B. With the widespread diffusion of the mouse as an essential peripheral from the mid-1980s, we gradually abandoned the command prompt or the command parser in favor of the mouse pointer, with or without drop-down menus or icons. This is why we call this genre point-and-click. Later, we observed a gradual decline of this type of game with the emergence of the first-person shooter genre, or FPS, in which the player adopts the protagonist's point of view and in which it's necessary to shoot all the antagonists that show up and interact with elements and or objects scattered throughout the course. Future Wars is therefore one of the many point-and-click games that exist at the time when they were popular, just like Operation Stealth, to name just one.
And it's a genre that I've become attached to and haven't given up on, in part because it had its golden age between my adolescence and my young adult years.
The synopsis of the game boils down to this: you must rescue the princess. Actually, not quite, although there's a woman in the game. The latter opens with a cutscene followed by credits, in which cutscene we see a flying saucer as well as people shooting at it. Then the game begins with a window cleaner protagonist who discovers in a hidden room next to his boss's office a time machine. Time travel that will then be possible will allow him to change the course of humanity, let's say. The scenario is therefore divided into 5 chapters corresponding to 4 distinct eras. All of them have some sort of mission to complete before moving on to the next one. It's very linear in that you have to do X in/on screen A before being able to do Y in/on screen B.
And no need to tell me about temporal paradoxes in the comments. No game escapes this, and that goes for movies and novels.
The first part takes place in the present time, and it's a fairly short chapter compared to the others, but it already gives an overview of the challenges you will encounter in the upcoming chapters in terms of solving puzzles, not to mention that time is sometimes counted. The second part takes place in the past, somewhere in the Middle Ages, let's say, with a castle, a tavern, a monastery. It's a more or less intuitive segment in which you will die dozens of times, so better get into the habit of saving your games. The third part takes place in an apocalyptic future which hides a segment in the sewers, then in the metro, then in a kind of more or less futuristic airport where technology seems to have stopped at that of the beginning of the 20th century. The fourth part, meanwhile, takes place in prehistory, but has very few plot elements. Basically, you have to shoot alien soldiers before getting to and into the spaceship. We then move on to the mothership, which takes us somewhere, say to an alien space station. Once you manage to avoid the enemy guards, you have 6 minutes to get to and back from the control room after reprogramming a bomb using a magnetic card.
A magnetic card like we used in the 1980s.
Besides, all the technology illustrated is not very futuristic. In the third segment, we still use fuses to turn on a small television set, with a flat screen of course, which will be useful to distract a guard while we take the escalator.
I'm not an expert futurist, but in 4315 I would expect other types of screens or displays than LCD ones. And given that the escalator is only 128 years old at the time of this episode's upload, I hope that more types of stairs will be invented over the next 2,291 years.
In addition, the game illustrates scenes of teleportation through time, which brings me to think that we could also travel by teleportation in the future rather than by public transport. As for the sewers, modern sewers, let's say, if we don't take into account the old collectors, the invention and their construction date back barely more than 2 centuries. Again, I wonder about the sewers of the future, but I have a feeling they will be different than those we have today.
Also, what's this trend of having sewer segments in games?
In terms of immersion, it's not bad. I don't feel as invested in the protagonist's goal in Future Wars as I am in other games like Maupiti Island, but I follow its progression. The visual aspect counts for a lot in this immersion, more particularly in the futuristic apocalyptic segment. We are there. All that's missing is a digitized soundscape, and everything would be perfect. It's a recurring theme, which illustrates a pessimistic contemporary vision of the future and which applies to cinema. Seriously, out of all the games I own for the Xbox 360, quite a few of them depict a devastated world in which you must wander and survive. This reminds me of one of the fighting fantasy books that I love and still own, Freeway Fighter by Ian Livingstone. Otherwise, the second segment, which takes place in the Middle Ages, is not bad either, even though I would have invested in the religious bigotry of the time, with a threat due to a form of pandemic of bubonic plague, just to make the game more complicated.
In short, this game is one of those that I consider acceptable.
Visually, it's neat. We intelligently exploit the 16-color palette of the Atari ST, which palette we modify as needed depending on the screen being displayed. It's not quite on par with Maupiti Island, published the following year, but it's satisfactory for the time. Sound-wise, we use the tone channels both for music and for effects. Having pushed further, as I said earlier, I would have opted for a digitized soundscape, like in E-Char for example, but the sounds in Future Wars remain satisfactory. Regarding the music, however, I wonder about the melodic choices or songs or whatever, which do not quite suit the atmosphere. This is a more remarkable aspect in a game like Return to Zork in its CD-ROM version, for which the musical score better supports or reinforces the story and its atmosphere and visuals, and this is also true for Myst, to mention only these games.
Now that I've talked about the qualities of the game, I will address its flaws, starting with the spelling mistakes in the text boxes for the French version.
Really, there are almost none that do not display at least one spelling or grammar mistake, which arouses a bit of indignation in/for the French teacher that I once was. Elementary school mistakes. It's shameful.
Okay, I'm exaggerating a little, and for some mistakes, it's often that accents are missing or incorrectly used.
Also, to interact with objects, you have to get closer to them. It's not like in Monkey Island where you can click on an element of the setting on the other side of the screen and watch your character move before interacting with the object in question. In Future Wars, you have to position yourself correctly prior. Additionally, regarding the correlation between the items and the plot per se, it sometimes follows Moon logic, to the point that I wonder how one could get through the game without a walkthrough. Otherwise, it sometimes happens that objects are barely or not visible. For example, two joined pixels representing a tiny flag, which must be taken and pinned on the world map in the next room, in a very specific spot indicated by another small pixel. In Maupiti Island, the magnifying glass magnifies pixels on the screen, and if there's an object of interest, the latter is illustrated in detail in the magnifying glass, rather than being made up of a hodgepodge of pixels that don't show anything more than if you had used a real magnifying glass in front of the screen.
It's not that the object is important in Maupiti Island, but it indicates that it can be grabbed, taken, or touched.
Moreover, regarding the contextual action menu, it is austerity in the economic or frugal sense. Admittedly, I was somewhat offended that we had bothered to have both the turn on and turn off options in Maniac Mansion, while a simple turn on/off would have sufficed. Regardless, the number of available actions in Maniac Mansion seems sufficient to me and representative of what text adventures used to be. In any case, there aren't that many important actions overall. Even by forcing the note, I can barely count more than 20, and that's really because I insist in being precise. For example, the actions push and pull can be summarized as move. Regardless, I was pleased with the Full Throttle game's action interface, which was very intuitive and representative of the trend in point-and-click games, which trend was to make interactions as simple as possible.
However, in an ideal game, for me, several objects should have several uses or purposes.
Production-wise, regarding the sprites, there is no scaling of the protagonist per se, which means that to change his size, we use an off-screen moment to make the transition, like in The Last Crusade. Scaling is problematic without blittering unless you build a character using polygons like in Cruise for a Corpse, because you have to make the character less and less visible on the binary scale, which involves subtracting pixels to it, taking into account the 4 bit planes of the ST's screen memory, a programming headache. Finally, the story of Future Wars is rather short when you have a walkthrough at your disposal, and the game can be completed in less than 2 hours, which brings me to talk about replayability.
Given the linear aspect of Future Wars, I don't really see the point in replaying it once the game is finished.
There is no subplot, and as far as I know, no random elements. Everything happens on cue. It's certainly difficult to achieve something random or open world for point-and-click games, but not infeasible, although Future Wars wasn't designed that way. Randomly defined text adventures were made very early in the history of games, but these were text adventures without visuals, therefore without the need for an artist to draw every setting and make it appealing, and in this sense, for more or less 2 decades, adventure games remained prisoners of their linearity, perhaps precisely because of their splendid yet rather static visuals.
Monkey Island is somewhat of an exception to the rule at the time, in the sense that you can wander from one location to another, although to progress in the plot you must perform actions in a certain order.
There was also the problem of storage. The number of images that can be stored on a single floppy disk, even if these images are compressed, remains limited, which implies that to have a universe of considerable size, it's necessary to have several floppy disks, which involves a lot of disk swapping. Just think of Ultima 5 in its Apple II version, one of my favorite games ever, for which I made an episode a few years ago. 4 floppy disks, 8 sites, and a whole lot of disk swapping during gameplay when came the time to enter a city, a village, an abbey, or a dungeon. This was the compromise for this open-world type game running on a second-generation computer. All this amounts to saying that the interest of a point-and-click game lies partly in solving riddles or puzzles aimed toward the outcome or resolution of the game, and it's fortunate that there are so many currently available online via abandonware sites for those who do not own the original copies. In this sense, we can consider ourselves pampered compared to 30 years ago.
Finally, to judge the game Future Wars compared to its competitors of the time, let's say that it holds up poorly in my opinion, but I may be a little harsh.
I won't make it compete with Maupiti Island. That would be too easy and unfair given that they are 2 different point-and-click games, Maupiti Island also being released the following year. It would be more accurate to compare it to The Last Crusade, the ST version of which is modeled on the PC version running DOS in EGA mode, with the difference that The Last Crusade follows an already established scenario with some freedoms. Because of its scenario, if we ignore the extraterrestrials and the threat they represent, Future Wars is somewhat akin to the spirit of the game Chrono Quest, which I will talk about in a future episode, a game which also involves a journey in time, but whose interface is closer to that of Maupiti Island.
This was today's episode. As usual, thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me, the link is in the description. Not only do my patrons have priority regarding the games to talk about, but they also get sneak previews throughout the development of whatever projects there may be. Otherwise, like, subscribe, share, and don't hesitate to let me know your thoughts regarding Future Wars in the comments. Have you ever completed it? And if so, was it without any walkthrough whatsoever? Also, if there are any games you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I'm Guy from the other day. See you soon.